Thanks again for attending our webinar today. My name is Nathan Krampe, and I'm honored to be here to talk about the extra 2% with Jonah Keri, a best-selling author on the New York Times. He's going to talk a lot about not only baseball and the Devil Rays, but how we can apply just that extra 2% to our lives and our careers to just promote, just a better lifestyle. So a couple of things I wanted to note before we get going. First and foremost, we do specialize here at Summit Investment Advisors just in everything related to the financial education, which you can actually find this recording as well as others at our website, summitinvest.com. So the three areas of expertise, we have financial planning, investment management, and then the tax planning and estate preservation. If you need any of those types of plans, please contact us, and we would be definitely willing to meet with you. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Jonah Keri. Like I said before, he is a New York Times best-selling author for The Extra 2% and Up, Up, and Away. He's a contributor on ESPN's Baseball Tonight and writes for CBS Sports and Sports Illustrated. And he also hosts his own podcast where he does many great interviews, so please go and check that out. Lastly of note, he actually did write for over 11 years for the Investor's Business Daily and is very familiar with the intimate details of stock and the stock market. So with that, Jonah Keri, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Nathan, and apologies for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad to be here, and yeah, lots to talk about here. So I think first and foremost, we should get into the basic idea of what is the extra 2%, which is after the intro slide would be the first slide. And just to give some background on this, this baseball team, the Tampa Bay Rays, it's an interesting story. They were horribly owned for quite a long time, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, but really bad ownership. And when you have any kind of company, any kind of business that is run poorly from the top down, that's going to create a lot of problems. They're sold eventually to a consortium led by a guy named Stuart Sternberg. Sternberg was a Goldman guy. He actually worked for a place called Spear Leeds. Spear Leeds, of course, a market maker. They were sold for $1 billion, pretty much at the peak of this kind of thing, of the M&A, I guess you could say bubble at that point. This is roughly 2000. And Sternberg comes away with quite a big share. Actually, excuse me, they were sold for $6 billion. He was one of 6 partners, so that was nice for him. Goes over to Goldman, Spear Leeds is over there, and he's working with a gentleman named Matthew Silverman. And those two guys end up buying the team and recruiting a guy named Andrew Friedman, who was a private equity person, very young at that time, about 25 years old. And they bring him in first, not as a GM specifically, but just kind of as a lower-level employee. And then he eventually rises to the role of general manager of the team. So these are the 3 people that are controlling the organization. And of course, if you are in the financial field at all, or I think at this point this word probably has some universal currency, what Sternberg and Friedman and Silverman set out to do is they set out to deploy arbitrage in the baseball field. That's essentially the idea here, and we all know what arbitrage is. You're basically buying and selling securities, currency, commodities, whatever, essentially at the same time, and looking for very small advantages over and over and over and over. And if you do that, the belief on Wall Street is that eventually you will make a significant amount of money. It just takes some time and patience and skill and accuracy and so forth. So this is basically what the Tampa Bay Rays set up to do. They said, okay, we're in a position where we're a really bad team. This was the lasting stock of baseball, a last place team in 2007. But that team was already under the control of Friedman and Silverman and Sternberg, and some of these things were already underway. Some of the little pieces of arbitrage, those extra 2% advantages were in place. That is specifically how Sternberg put it. He said, Tampa Bay Rays, much, much lower payroll than, for instance, the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees, who played in the same division as them. Something like 1/5 as much money was being spent on players by Tampa Bay as it was in Boston and New York. So how are you going to beat Boston and New York? They have so much more money, so many more resources, so much more history, talent, all that. It's to specifically find these 2% advantages. And it occurred in all kinds of different ways, but I'm going to walk you through one of them in particular, and this is a pretty baseball-heavy example, so I'll try to walk through it a little bit slowly here. But essentially, The Rays had a player named, at the time they were the Devil Rays, by the way. They changed their name from Devil Rays to Rays. They exorcised the devil and they became better. That is kind of what the central conceit of the book. So anyway, they had a guy named Delman Young. Delman Young comes into the major leagues in 2007 and is really, really, really good by traditional stats. He had 96 runs batted in, hits for a bunch of power, has a high batting average. And if you're just looking on the back of a baseball card, the way that you would in baseball history for many, many years, and the way that we all did as kids, you would just say, wow, a really good player, and he's a rookie. Oh, gosh, he's only going to get better. But what the Rays understood, what their management understood, which was pretty much before anybody else in the industry did, was that, number one, if you look at offensive stats, home runs and runs batted in and batting average, if you look at them from those old viewpoints, you're going to find that they are lacking, that they don't tell you the full story. So that's one. And two is that even looking at offense alone isn't going to give you everything. So Delman Young, despite being a pretty good offensive player, not a great offensive player, but a good one, was a terrible defensive player. And we didn't yet have metrics to look at this. You know, the same way that Summit and companies of that ilk would be really trying to use analytics, trying to use metrics to break everything down. This was the Rays. They were saying, okay, we don't necessarily have publicly available information on this. We're going to go build our own database and figure this out for ourselves. And so they do. And what they find is that Delman Young is a terrible defensive player. This is a young guy. He should be spry, should be able to run down fly balls. He was a right fielder. But he's bad at it. He has bad range. He judges fly balls poorly. His throwing arm is overrated. There's nothing about him that's really good defensively at all. And the Rays realized that this player, who is really, really good, ends up winning the Rookie of the Year award, by the way, so the best newcomer into all of baseball. They realize that he's completely an overvalued asset, and this is a chance for them to exchange an overvalued assets for assets that are going to help them in other ways. And so what they set out to do is basically shop him around. They look around, they say, okay, this guy's not very good, or at least not as good as he's believed to be. Let's go find other opportunities. And they reach out to the Minnesota Twins. And in one fell swoop, they improved their franchise tremendously by acquiring two different players. One was a pitcher named Matt Garza, and that was pretty much what you see is what you get. He was a very good young pitcher. He threw very hard fastball. He had good secondary stuff. Everything about him, traditionally, analytically, you would say he was good. No problem. There wasn't any nuance to that. But the other thing that they did was that they acquired a shortstop named Jason Bartlett. Jason Bartlett was not a star player at all. But what he did really well was he played really good defense. A little guy, didn't hit much, but he solidified their defense. And the Rays had seized upon something very interesting, which is that even though offensively Jason Bartlett was nowhere near what Delman Young was, the defensive value generated by this player would be enormous and would change all of it, the complete complexion of the team. And so they get Bartlett, and they get other players who are not necessarily regarded as big hitters, but great defensive players. And all of a sudden, the big weakness that Tampa Bay had in 2007, where they were the worst team in the league, becomes a strength, which is that they play tremendous defense. Everywhere on the diamond, they're really, really good. And some of that was addition, certainly getting Bartlett and some other players like that, and some of it was addition by subtraction, where they're not necessarily acquiring a whole bunch of all-stars, but just by getting rid of guys who just don't fit the mold, they can make it work. And they were able to do that with that trade. It became enormously successful. And this book would not have gotten written if not for the 2008 season. After finishing in last place in 2007, the Rays finish in first place in 2008, and they go on to win the American League pennant and go to the World Series. That's in 1 year. They improved by 30-some wins in one season, which is a remarkable turnaround. And really the start of that was looking for that little edge. The little edge ended up becoming a big edge, unbeknownst to the rest of the league, which is let's try to specialize in defense and not necessarily worry about home runs and runs batted in. But the basic premise was we're going to try to swap commodities here. We're going to get rid of this one commodity, find another one, and find that advantage. It just happened to work out better than anybody would have. Let's go to the next one. And here we've got the idea of thinking a little differently. And this is absolutely something that the Rays did extremely well. They were just experts at it, and they made it work for them. And in this case, we talk about whatever it is, wherever the field is, whether it's investing, whether it's baseball, what have you, you're not necessarily looking to invent a new wheel, basically. You have to figure out what to do with the wheel that you have. You don't need to invent a brand new way. It's a different spin on an existing practice, and the idea here is it could pay off big rewards and big dividends. So in the case of the Rays, What they were interested in is looking at the same kind of stuff. They were definitely trying to be cutting edge and come up with new statistics and new approaches to baseball and so forth. But they also thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe there are some things that everybody's just doing wrong and we're not really seeing it. Let's try to think about that a little bit. And to the Rays' credit, they were a very open-minded organization. So they weren't necessarily interested only in what the person who's been there for 30 years would do, or the baseball life or what have you, the person with all the bona fides. They would look at every opinion, and if the opinion and or the facts had merit, then they would go with that. And it didn't matter who the messenger was. That's really tough to do, by the way, because we live in a hierarchical society. The companies that we work in are hierarchical. We respond to the division manager and then the VP and then the CEO and so forth. And it's tough. It's tough to value everybody's opinions equally because there's value obviously to experience. There's value to gravitas, to leadership. All those things do matter. That's absolutely true. But we can't necessarily close our eyes and our ears to what potentially younger employees, different kinds of talent bring to the table. So in the case of the Rays, they had a bunch of young people working in that organization, and those people had the ear of everybody. That includes the manager, Joe Maddon, who's now the manager of the Chicago Cubs, who are a very successful team. At the time with Tampa Bay, he was one of the architects of this big turnaround. That includes the general manager, Andrew Friedman, and even the owner, Stuart Sternberg. If you had a good idea, no matter what your background was, it was in play. We could take a look at it. So here is a case where the Rays are looking at things they could do to try to make themselves better. They identified defense as a big one. But even on a granular level, they're trying to figure this out. And one thing that they came across was this idea of how hitters match up with pitchers. So typically, for as long as baseball has existed pretty much, we've understood that if you are a right-handed pitcher, then the other team would want to have a left-handed batter at the plate. If it's a left-handed pitcher, it's a right-handed batter. Why? Because of how the ball is thrown. So if you think about a right-handed pitcher, he's kind of hiding the ball with his front shoulder, and he's only releasing it late. If you're a right-handed hitter, you don't get that clear view of it because your shoulder, I wish I could do this visually, but your shoulder is closed to the guy. So you can't quite see it until it comes out later. Whereas if you're a left-handed batter, your point of view is right at the pitcher. You can see it perfectly. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Left-handed hitters hit right-handed pitchers better and vice versa. The Rays are being dominated at the time by a pitcher named Mike Mussina. Mike Mussina is a really, really good pitcher. And Mike Mussina is a right-handed pitcher and really, really tough to hit. And the Rays are stacking their lineup of left-handed hitters, and they're not having any success. Some of these guys are pretty talented hitters, but they're not doing well. Mussina's killing them. Mussina was a great pitcher, so he did dominate a lot of guys. But the Rays didn't just accept that. They said, well, maybe we could try to find a different way here. And what they seize upon is this idea that the way that Mussina throws, he has a particular pitch. It's called a knuckle curveball. Curveball simply curves. A knuckle curveball is a curveball that's thrown such that you're basically spiking your finger into the ball and creating this knuckling action on it. So it curves and it sinks and it also spins weirdly. Very, very tough pitch, very, very rare pitch to hit. Well, here's the thing about knuckleballs in general, anything to do with a knuckleball grip, knuckle curves, straight knuckleballs, what have you. It turns out that when you look at the data, you find that same-handed hitters are better at hitting it. So if Mussina is a right-handed pitcher, paradoxically, what you need to do is stack your lineup with right-handed hitters. Nobody in the league is doing this. This is a very strange approach. But there's this 22-year-old, essentially intern, who takes it to Joe Maddon, the manager. Joe Maddon has been in baseball for, at this point, about 35 years. He's earned his way to the top of his profession. He's managing this team. And here comes this kid saying, blah, 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 I got this new stuff for you. And Maddon says, great, what do you got? Explains all these data. Maddon says, all right, we're going to use this in a game. Not a practice, not an exhibition game, not spring training. He's going to use it in a real game against the New York Yankees of all teams. A very, very good team, very rich team, and a team that's a direct rival of the Tampa Bay Rays. So they trot this approach out against Mike Mussina, and they see what happens. And what happens that day? The Rays destroy Mike Mussina. They light him up. They score a whole bunch of runs. They win the game handily. Now, as many of you would obviously be quantitatively inclined, you would understand, of course, that this could be construed as a small sample size. Maybe it's the case that the Rays got lucky that day. Mussina rolled out of bed and he was fighting a flu. His dog was ill. Who knows? So you take that with a grain of salt. The Rays, also understanding that, don't necessarily believe that their theory has been validated. They go out and they try to prove it again and again. So what ends up happening is, when Mussina comes up next time, they use the same approach, and it totally works again. Okay, now you've got a little bit of a larger sample. You say, well, maybe this is something that's happening. And what they come to realize is that they can now apply this to ending any kind of unorthodox pitcher who has a pitch that really neutralizes hitters at bat from the opposite side. And in particular, they realize that if you throw a changeup, that works. A changeup is a pitch that's essentially a slower version of a fastball, except it also can kind of fade away from the hitter. So it creates this effect that it is really strong against opposite-handed hitters. So again, if it's a right-handed pitcher, it works well against left-handed hitters, left-handed pitcher against right-handed hitters. So they start doing this across the board against guys who throw changeups, any kind of knuckleball, anything like that, and over and over and over again, it keeps working. And suddenly, because of a kid, because of being open-minded to this kid, they've come across something that can help them in 8, 9, 10, 12 games a season. And if you think about the margins in sports, baseball, basketball, hockey, football, what have you, if you give yourself a big chance to win in that many games over the course of a season, well, that's a big change. That all of a sudden can take you from being a bad team to a mediocre team to a good team, and a good team to a great team. And the Rays had talent, and they did have some analytical methods that worked really well, and suddenly they realized this is something that could put us over the top just by using a little bit of a different spin on something that everybody had done, every team had done for decades and decades. Let's go to the next one. So there's this idea of studying mistakes more than successes. And the Rays were really good at this in many respects. And they were good about this on the field, but I want to talk about what they did off the field too, because I think that this is a universal principle that applies, again, whether we're talking about Summit's line of business or any other. So, you know, there's a certain amount of validation that you want. If you do something well, it's nice to dwell on it. You know, we don't want to shunt it to the side. You want to celebrate. You want to go out and have a cocktail afterwards or whatever it is you do, have a piece of cake and appreciate that you made something happen that was good, you affected change, that's all great. But if you really want to grow as a business or any kind of enterprise, really, you have to understand what you're doing wrong. You have to be self-critical, which is a really tough thing to do. As human beings, we're just not wired that way. Joe Madden, the manager of the Tampa Bay Rays, has and still does study psychology extensively. So this is a baseball manager, and he's constantly reading psychology books. It's a big thing of his. In fact, if you were to ask people what the two most notable things of a Joe Madden would be, they would argue that it's that he reads psychology books and that he enjoys Merlot. Those are the two things, which is an interesting thing for a baseball manager and has earned him some criticism. But in the eyes of the media, we kind of love him because we feel like, wow, this is a quirky guy who's thoughtful and different, and that's fun. So anyway, he's thinking about this, and he's realizing that mistakes are something that you have to look at. You have to be willing to say, I am flawed. How can I fix this? Very, very difficult for an individual, certainly difficult for a corporation, and can be especially difficult, by the way, if you're a successful business. So Tampa Bay is starting to have some success in 2008, and they're getting better, and they're not necessarily the sad sack team that they were. And Madden is saying, this isn't good enough. We have to kind of identify other stuff. So they do this on the field in all kinds of ways, and this could be, you know, as we mentioned, things like defense, things like how to handle a bullpen, which pitchers to put in certain spots, that if a pitcher gives up a 3-run home run or whatever, it might not be that the pitcher, the fault of the pitcher, it might have been the fault of the manager. It might have been that Joe Madden just made the wrong decision. He has to self-identify, figure that out, and fix it. But the interesting thing here about the Rays is that even though they're a baseball team, they say, well, wait a minute, there's off-field practices too that we're doing wrong. And so what they start to do is they start to really delve deep into this. And one of the most interesting ones to me was the way that they approach their marketing. There's a whole chapter in the Extra 2% about the marketing approach of the Tampa Bay Rays. Here is a team that not only was bad, but they just were a disaster when it came to making money. And there's certainly a correlation there, because when you think about it, you know, people don't necessarily want to go out and watch a lousy team play in any sport. Same way you wouldn't want to go out and watch a lousy Broadway play or, let's say, Batman versus Superman, which was terrible. There's just things you wouldn't want to do. You would just say, all right, I want a better product than this. The Rays realize that, and they understand they have to fix on the field, but they say, we're going to go out and fix off the field too. So when they're thinking about how to fix their marketing, they're also thinking about their stadium experience. And the stadium experience isn't something that would come to mind globally. It's not like all of Major League Baseball would be fixating on how one particular team is handling their in-person customers. But the Rays decide that they're going to do things differently, and they're going to try to fix those mistakes. So here is an example of a mistake that they had made in the past. there were a few stories about the old owner, Vince Namoli. Vince Namoli was the original owner of the Tampa Bay Rays, and he was terrible. He was terrible in every single way. He was a tyrant. He insisted that employees pay for their own parking every time they showed up to the stadium, which was unbelievable. He kicked beat writers out of the press box for eating pizza that they purchased from concessions rather than eating the press box food, which is remarkable. That is never done anywhere. And I think that the most horrific thing that I came across was the story of an old folks home. They bust in a couple of buses from people, retirees, folks in their 70s and 80s, to come watch the game. Great. Sounds like a nice experience for the day. And included in that busload of people is an older couple. They're about 80 years old. And the wife is in a wheelchair. Husband is not. Husband wheels the wife to the front gate, and they've got a plan. Okay, so you're going to get in. Everybody's going in as a group, whatever. And the wife is holding a little plastic bag full of something. And so the person, the ticket taker, basically, the person allowing people to go through, says, "What do you got there?" She says, "I got almonds." He says, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't bring outside food into the stadium." She says, "Well, I actually need it. It's for my blood sugar. It's for my nutrition. I really, really do need this. It's very important that I have it on me at all times. I've got some health issues, what have you." A fight ensues between the 20-something ticket taker and the 80-something husband about whether or not she's allowed almonds into the ballpark. Any sane person would realize that this is a reasonable exception. This is not going to lead to anarchy in the ballpark in which people are bringing foot-long chili dogs and coolers of beer into the stadium. It is a one-time exception. But there is no intellectual flexibility here. And this has been fostered by Namoli, who has taught all his employees no tolerance policy, the friendly vibe in the stadium. You're never going to see that at a Tampa Bay Devil Rays game. It's just going to be like this. It's going to be exactly his way. And he was very, very much a micromanager. If you think that 25-year-old ticket taker was not influenced by Namoli, even though Namoli was the owner of the team and a multi-millionaire, you are wrong. Everybody was influenced by this guy. So what Stu Sternberg, the new owner, decides to do is to recalibrate everybody. He doesn't necessarily fire the existing employees. He says, all right, we're going to retrain you. We're going to study this mistake, and we're going to make it better. And it's really simple stuff if you think about it. The Tampa Bay Rays played in St. Petersburg, Florida, not far at all away from Orlando, Florida. And Orlando, Florida is the home of Disney World. He sends every single employee of the entire organization there, and he says, let's learn from Disney. I mean, they have wildly successful businesses, including this theme park, that teaches a positive environment and a real customer service and really attending to people. Why are we not using this as an asset? Let's go ahead and do this. They go, they train under people there, employees, leadership groups, what have you, and they come back, and it's a completely changed environment. And the first year that they deploy these new practices is not actually 2008 when they become good. This is 06. This is 07. This is when the Tampa Bay Devil Rays are still bad. And you already start to see some good responses. You already start to see fans starting to stream into the stadium, a happier experience. Everything just becomes much, much more pleasant. Certainly nobody confiscating a tiny bag of almonds from an 82-year-old woman. That does not happen anymore. And lo and behold, when the team does become good, it's not just that the team's success propels them to better attendance and a lot of better financial circumstances. It's that this change in approach, which is we were doing something wrong, and the previous ownership was doing something wrong as well, let's go ahead and change this. And they do. And it has nothing to do with batting average or ERA or anything like that. It's just about identifying this one thing, which is just as important, which is treat your customers well. They realize it, they fix it, and it helps the organization tremendously. Go to the next one. And I'm going to drink water for 1 second, if you don't mind. Okay, so let's talk about the idea of achieving success and how do you get to the kind of next level of success. So here's something that the Tampa Bay Rays started to do really well before they became good as well, which is that they realized that they need to keep their pitchers healthy. And they started to do a pretty good job of it. And this ties into what we're talking about here, which is that even after you come up with a great idea, you can refine it and you can improve on it. So the Tampa Bay Rays, under the new leadership, start to find ways to have their pitchers avoid the disabled list. There's all kinds of ways that they do this to avoid having them get injured. Some of it is luck, I will grant you. It's not very easy to throw a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, and guys can break down doing that. But the Rays realize that they can not necessarily use that as an excuse. They can do better than that. And so what they start doing is they start implementing very aggressive programs to accentuate player health. And that includes everything. So one example is, if you think about the way that teams typically interact with pitchers, it's usually reactive rather than proactive. So in other words, if a pitcher gets hurt, okay, he has surgery, all right, well, we got to train him back up to get his strength back and so forth, and it's always happening after the fact. What the Rays start preaching are different approaches. They start throwing differently and at different intervals. They start using different kinds of training exercises that the team was not using before, that really no other team was using before, led by Jim Hickey, who was the pitching coach, as well as a really good training staff. And they start becoming healthier. And the results start paying off almost immediately. Matt Garza, who was a pitcher that I mentioned, he comes out and pitches really, really well, even better than he did with his former team. James Shields, who was already a big, strong pitcher and had shown himself to be durable, he becomes even more durable, and he pitches well over 200 innings in the 2008 season, pitches deep into the playoffs, and looks just as good on the last day of the season as he does on the first day. That's all great. And piggybacking off of that, they realize they've got these new techniques, but they need to also have different approaches when it comes to personnel. And so in lieu of having older personnel, in lieu of having older pitchers, they start going much younger. They start looking for guys that specifically have a clean bill of health, even if their skill level is not as high as the other guy. They're saying, all right, well, this player sounds pretty good. He's got pretty good numbers, but he's probably going to break down. And so they absolutely load up the entire pitching staff, the starting rotation, the bullpen, everybody, with really, really healthy young pitchers, which sounds very simple, but is actually a great approach. And from this point, they go from being a healthy-ish team, but not necessarily successful, to all of a sudden you've got these younger pitchers. And the way that baseball works, I guess much as in life, is as we acquire experience and we have that kind of nexus of experience and skill, that's when we really hit our peak and we really start to excel. And that was the case with that team. The 2008 team succeeded because they were healthy, and also because the roster was absolutely littered with guys who are 25, 26 years old, which is the point at which baseball players often make a quantum leap. You can go from being good to really, really, really good. And that's exactly what happened that year. So you've got talented players, you've got players who are healthy, and the Rays say, all right, we could do better than that. Let's really hone in here. Let's use different techniques, different training techniques, different methods of player acquisition, and we're going to build a healthy club. And not just 2008, but from that season on and well into 2010, not one member of the Tampa Bay Rays starting rotation for 2.5 years went on the disabled list. We don't have injury data going back to the dawn of time, but as far as we know, that's the only time that's ever happened in baseball history, ever, where you've got 5 guys. They would have, maybe they'd miss a day here or there, but they never went on the disabled list and missed 15 days or more for 2.5 years. A truly remarkable streak, which again has something to do with luck, but a lot to do with preparation and to having a good idea and making it even better. Let's go to the next one. And here we've got this idea of really trusting the data and understanding how important data can be for you. And this really plays out in multiple ways for the Rays. They're trying to figure out essentially that they want to trust data and not doubters. And so I mentioned a bunch of these, obviously, and defense would be first and foremost the biggest one. And this is their own data, by the way. So, this is going to cause external doubt because the rest of the world doesn't have access to the analytics that the Rays do. The Rays have built their own system from the ground up, and they've made it work. And they're jettisoning players who are hitting 20 and 25 home runs for little pipsqueaks who don't hit 25 home runs but play tremendous defense. That's one. Another is this idea of the techniques, which we talked about, which is the idea of going up with same-handed pitchers and using same-handed hitters and so forth. They're doing things like that. But it really goes across the board. They're trying all kinds of different things. So, for instance, one big example, and this is probably the most important thing that a manager can do on the field anyway, is what he does with his bullpen. If you think about your starting rotation and everybody's very healthy, your 5 guys come out and they're starting games and they're all looking good and that's fine, eventually you have to take them out of games. And typically you have a certain hierarchy for the way that you handle your bullpen, which is if it's the 7th inning, you're going to use a certain guy, and if it's the 8th inning, you're going to use a certain guy, and if it's the 9th inning, you're going to use a certain guy. And Joe Madden, to his credit, decides, well, that's no good. I'm going to use it based on very, very specific circumstances, and I'm going to really dig into the data and understand this and use it in a way that nobody else in baseball is doing. And so they would do these things that looked absolutely puzzling. As one example, they would have a situation, let's say, where the game was close, maybe they're leading by 1 run or tied, what have you, and the bases might be loaded and there's 1 out. Well, in that case, you would normally say, wow, gosh, I really need a big, strong pitcher who can throw 98 miles an hour and strike the next guys out, and give me the best guy that we got. Let's just do that. That's not what Joe Madden did. Madden would say, all right, we got the bases loaded and 1 out. What is the most favorable outcome here? The most favorable outcome would be a double play. It would be if somebody hit the ball on the ground weakly to the shortstop or the second baseman, and they turn it into a double play. And so what Madden starts doing is he's not only looking at matchups in terms of right-hander versus left-hander or anything like that, or can I strike this guy out? He's looking for specifics. He's trying to leverage the data and leverage the analytics in a way that will work for him. And so he comes across something which he realizes is going to work, which is that he goes to a ground ball pitcher. Here's a guy who throws very, very soft, basically what we would call a junk baller. He throws soft pitches, but what hitters tend to do is they make contact a lot, and they just kind of smash him into the ground, and they turn into a lot of double plays. And the pitcher that they end up using in that environment very often is a guy named Chad Bradford. Here's an interesting one. I would say that a bunch of you would probably be familiar with the book and the movie Moneyball, and the extra 2% does have some common themes with Moneyball. Certainly, it's a team that did not necessarily have a huge payroll and ended up achieving success by using analytics. Chad Bradford actually pitched for the Oakland A's for that Moneyball team before going over to the Tampa Bay Rays. So the Rays were definitely doing this they were winking a little bit. You know, there's no shame in necessarily aping the best practices of rival companies. Obviously, there's intellectual property involved and so forth. You can't literally rip off stuff. But if there are practices out there that are known and they're working, that's okay. You go with that. The only guiding principle has to be that you're using data, that you're using smart practices, that you're not just kind of dreaming things up or going with your gut without being able to justify it. So the Rays do, and their bullpen, which was the worst in baseball in 2007, goes on to become one of the best in baseball in 2008. And a lot of that has to do with those managing techniques, with putting guys in the right situation to succeed, even if it seems counterintuitive. And what would happen in that bases loaded situation is that quite frequently, more frequently than you would expect, sure enough, the guy would hit the ball, the hitter would hit the ball, smash it into the turf, and it would end up being a double play. You get out of the inning without exerting a bunch of effort, without necessarily having to burn your best guy. It was that particular pitcher that fit in that particular circumstance because the data told us that it did. Go to the next one. And here we get to this idea, and so we keep talking about the value of data, the value of analytics, whether it's for Summit, whether it's for Oracle, whether it's for Google, whether it's for anybody, and it certainly applies to baseball teams and sports teams in general. Absolutely. You want to have intelligent people running the team, ideally intelligent people playing the games, and you want to be able to have those data to back up your assertions. But you do need to put forth effort as well. And this is a very simple one, and so we're not going to dwell on this point too much, but I do think that it needs to be emphasized here. The idea of effort matters quite a bit. You know, you obviously have a responsibility, of course, to your clients to do the best that you can for them, and it means putting forth hours. You know, there's no question about it. Best practices are great, but if you're not feeling it, if you're not in the right mindset, what have you, then you're doing a disservice to your customers. It's just that is the nature of anything, and it's the case in baseball too. And I will give you one very simple lesson from this team, which really emphasized that the Rays cared about this, which is that Joe Madden's rules. So Joe Madden, the manager of the Tampa Bay Rays again, and now the manager of the Chicago Cubs, and he was just in the news with the Chicago Cubs actually, because just a couple of days ago, Chicago finished up a homestand and then they flew off to Pittsburgh. And what he had the players do, or he encouraged the players to do anyway, was dress up in the most ridiculous suits possible. So, I mean, you had people dressed up as the two main characters from the movie Dumb and Dumber. You had people dressed up in the suit from Batman, from the Riddler, where it was green with question marks on it. These players were fashion nightmares. They just looked absolutely terrible. This is an old practice that Madden has used for years and years going back to Tampa Bay. He's brought 30-foot pythons into the clubhouse. He's had pajama day. I mean, if you look at it from the outside, you would say, oh, this guy's a clown. He doesn't take baseball seriously, and what is he doing? And it's a mockery to the game. It's a disservice to the game. How dare he? This is very, very serious. You have to wear suits on airplanes. Keep your head down. Don't say anything. And again, Madden, who subscribes to psychology, says, you know what? It's 162 games. Every day you're playing baseball. It's August, and you're in Texas, and you're outside playing baseball. It's tough. Let players have some individuality. Encourage them to have some fun. Do all that stuff. And he did a great job of that and kept them loose throughout the season. The only rule that Joe Madden would have, the guy who said, dress up in pajamas, bring snakes, wear outrageous suits, do whatever you want, theme days, I'm going to drink Merlot and have chips and salsa waiting for the media when they come into the office, the iconoclast. The only thing that he said was hustle. Just try. Just make an effort to make things happen. And he was serious about this. This guy who was always smiling, always seemed to be in a good mood, and was always trying to encourage his players, if you hit a ground ball and you don't hustle to first base, no matter who you were, he would put you on the bench. And this happened in particular with one player, a guy named B.J. Upton, a very, very talented player, one of their best players. He would have lapses. He would have mental lapses. He wasn't a bad guy. There wasn't anything wrong with B.J. Upton. Sometimes he just wouldn't hustle. And to be honest with you, you're not necessarily doing that to great effect. In other words, if you hit a routine ground ball to the shortstop and you run or you don't run, it's probably not going to make a big difference because 99 times out of 100, the guy's going to make the play. Or I guess we should put it as 98 times out of 100, for the simple reason that you want to get that 2% advantage, which is that if the shortstop happens to bobble the ball or make a weird throw or whatever, by virtue of you hustling to first base, you have a chance to make it. Madden believed that those advantages were important, and he believed that you had to put in the effort to make that happen. And so he would bench Upton continually. He did it several times in the course of that season and in subsequent seasons. And eventually Upton did learn, and he became better at it. He ended up not becoming a superstar per se. That had a lot to do with other factors, which is baseball players unpredictable and so forth. But it got to the point where B.J. Upton said, all right, I've learned my lesson, and I'm going to make this happen. And again, it didn't make much of a difference over the course of one game per se. But if you look over the course of a season, there would be 2 or 3 or 4 plays where by virtue of hustling, the hitter would get on base as a result of the shortstop or the third baseman's error, and it would turn into a big inning. A big, big believer in that, Madden was and still is, and it really exemplifies his personality. And that idea, that method of leadership is a great one, by the way. You know, there are going to be, if you are in a large company of any kind, all kinds of different personalities. You can have the interview process, but you can't just snuff out people who have personality. You have to look for different approaches. You know, you have to have kinds of individuals. It's a healthy work environment that way, frankly. You want to have people be able to express themselves however they feel they should, you know, within reason. And Madden and the Rays did that. But if you're not trying, you're not an asset to your company. If you're a smart person and you have a lot going on upstairs, but you're just not willing to put forth the effort, then you're just not bound for whatever business. It's just not going to work. Madden understood that. The Rays understood that, and they worked it to their advantage. Let's go to the next one, which is finding the right balance. And this is where we can close this presentation. And this is a big one for me as well. So if you look at both the era in which the Rays became good and going back to Moneyball, and even today in baseball, there's still a tension. There's still a conflict. And the conflict is between people who believe in stats and people who believe in scouting. There are some advocates to either side who view this as a conflict. They think that you can't evaluate players by using both. They say, well, it's got to be one or the other, and I don't like the other side. I am somebody who believes in stats, and so scouts are old and they're terrible and they're useless. And scouts will say, well, I've always done it this way. I don't understand this newfangled stuff. Go back to your basement and eat your Pop-Tarts. I'm not buying all these new equations. It makes no sense to me. And I have a colleague who used to work with me at an organization called Baseball Prospectus. I now work for CBS Sports, and he's back working with me, actually. I've known this guy for a long time. And he had a great way to put this. Describing the right balance in baseball or any point in business and life, what have you, he would use the beer and tacos corollary. What would he say about beer and tacos? He would say, beer is delicious, and tacos are delicious. Why are we trying to pick between the two? This makes no sense. Why would we not pair beer and tacos? Two great tastes that go great together, and they can accentuate each other. You have a couple of tacos, you wash it down with a beer, even better. And this was something that the Rays came to realize really, really well. They drew so many accolades for their statistical acumen, for their analytical skill, for their ability to build a winning team by virtue of being cutting edge and the smartest guy at the table and everything like that but they also had a tremendous, tremendous group of scouts. Some of them had been in the business for 40 or 50 years, but there is value in experience and leadership and continuity and so forth. And what they did was they got everybody in the same room and they said, listen, we're going to use all of this together. How can we make this happen? And it took a while. It wasn't easy at first, but eventually, after a couple of years of really building relationships and fitting the pieces together, the Rays became really adept at not only using these little statistical advantages, that old intern, so to speak, but also those scouts. Those baseball lifers had a tremendous amount of wisdom to offer, and we need to accept their wisdom as well and bring it all to the table. And so to me, this is maybe the biggest takeaway, which is if you think about how you're going about your business, if you're thinking about the way that Summit operates, for instance, absolutely, you want to have all the analytical tools in the world at your disposal. There's no question about that. Of course, you do, and it's something that will guide you in your business and help you succeed. But there needs to be some form of recognition for intuition, for new ideas, for stuff that hasn't yet necessarily been, the hypothesis hasn't been tested yet, but let's at least bring those ideas to the table. And let's try to be creative, and let's try to think differently, and we'll see. We'll see if those ideas can get along with the data, but the hope is yes. And by using experience and by using leadership and combining it with oftentimes newer ideas and, frankly, younger employees and different approaches, analytical approaches, you can achieve something really, really great. And Tampa Bay Rays, beyond that season, beyond 2008, when they went to the World Series, they go on to make the playoffs 4 out of the next 6 years. And in those 6 years, they have the best record in the entire American League over that 6-year span. And again, they do that over and over with a tiny fraction of payroll of the other teams. The Boston Red Sox outspend them by a mile. The New York Yankees outspend them by a mile. Many other teams in the league outspend them by a mile. And time again, they keep overcoming the odds and making the playoffs with this little engine that could team in, frankly, a crummy stadium in a market that's not all that recognized compared to Boston or New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. And they do it again and again. And for that, they can thank beer and tacos. Thanks very much.